End Days. Nearly all festivals for the dead, worldwide, have their dates in the latter half of a year. Lachlan Torquill mused on that. He had time, after all, sitting with his forehead to a window of the small passenger plane headed from Edinburgh to Stavanger, looking down on clouds and sea. It would usually be pretty unwise to travel via air with the sorcerers of the Druidic Circle on his tail, but today, October 31st, they should have their hands full. And besides, if he took a ferry he'd be risking the Mr. Stewart worm, which would be the end of the boat as well as his fellow passengers. He tried to imagine what it must be like for normal people to have so many carefree options, and sighed through a wry smile. Disembarking from a flight after nothing more than mild turbulence, Stavanger was a disappointment. Lachlan searched the most likely location, eschewing the recently erected Sverdifjell swords in stone for Hivletonna, the high rock plateau overlooking Lysefjord. He preferred that old name to the modern Prikestolen, or Pulpit Rock. It was stunning, and there was a certain energy to the place, a taste to the air, but nothing of the caliber he was looking for. Lachlan politely declined an offer from a young married couple of Indian tourists to take a picture of him and made his way back down the path. Beside a little captive lake, still high on the fjord, he paused for a moment and watched Himalayan prayer flags dancing in the wind, left for good fortune by the Sherpas who had built the cut-stone path. Whether through some arcane property of the place or mere coincidence, that was where he felt it. Certainty, as clear as a change in the wind, that the circle now knew he had left and wasn't coming back. They would send a seeker to capture, or, if resisted, kill. Treason was not forgiven among their members lightly. Lachlan grimaced to himself, then shrugged. It was mid-afternoon. By the time they'd figured out where he was and what he was doing, he planned to be elsewhere. The ferry to Bergen, staying close to the fjords and therefore more or less safe for Lachlan, took 5 hours. This was altogether too much time to spend thinking about even the most rock-solid of plans, let alone his. He rubbed his eyes tiredly, having been up at 4 a.m. that morning to catch the bus to the ferry port, and steeled his will. He'd learned a lot from the Circle, spending most of the past decade studying at their castle in the Scottish Highlands and being sent on various missions. But the world was coming apart at the seams and they weren't doing anything about it. What was the fucking point of amassing all that ancient knowledge and training every day just to watch as the corrupt, greedy few steered society steadily deeper into decay, down into darkness and doom like a nuclear submarine gliding into the Mariana Trench? To begin with, he'd had a vague idea of stealing Thor's hammer and using it to knock some sense into the various world leaders and corporations he saw as to blame. Or, failing that, knocking the avarice out of them. With time to think, he decided reluctantly that Mjolnir would be out of his reach, but he was undeterred. Lachlan was going to make sure the old gods did something about the fall of their Midgard, and if they wouldn't, he'd find a way to do it himself. Where there's a will, there's a way, they say, and the only thing he wasn't short on was will. Lachlan wasn't stupid. He knew he'd probably die trying, but even that was preferable to quietly going about his life, getting depressed by news and voting futilely for the least bad representatives in government. It can be hard choosing between lesser evils when the corruption is already so embedded that the best democracy seems capable of is trimming its longer tendrils. The sun sparkled on the waves like Christmas lights of sparkling sapphire through his sunglasses, making him wonder if what he'd come for didn't lie somewhere far beneath them. The ferry was moving swiftly through Bifjorden, just in sight of Bergen, when Lachlan felt a change in the air for a second time. The Seeker was in Stavanger now, and they'd dispelled the anti-detection spell he'd spent an hour on last night far quicker than anticipated. So fast, it could only mean they'd sent their best. He groaned, rubbed his eyes again, then did what he'd been resisting for the last hour and bummed a cigarette off some older Canadian tourists. He thanked them, lighting it with a quick spark incantation mumbled behind a cupped hand. It tasted like hell, but it helped at least a little. He breathed out, watching the smoke cloud get whipped away by the salty wind, and wondered if the ferry had started serving alcohol yet. It had. The first thing he saw on leaving the terminal was, somewhat ironically, a ghost. He leaned against the wall of the multi-story parking garage, in its shadow so to avoid being rendered invisible in the midday sun. Lachlan swore under his breath as he approached. "Aye, Fergus," he sighed, leaning against the wall and looking out into the harbour so the ferry's other passengers wouldn't see him talking to nothing. "They sent her after me." "Aye, and you're fucking lucky they did." "How so?" Fergus looked at him, insubstantial eyes white and knowing. "Tora will be just as raging with me for leaving as any of the others. You know how she can be." He thought about it for a moment, one corner of his mouth tugging down. More raging, even. "She wants to know why." "She knows why." Fergus let out a hissing sound, having no breath with which to sigh. "Why you?" "Because I can." He left out the word probably, though he did think it. She knows that too. "Just..." The ghost straightened, looking Lachlan up and down. "Be quick. You have hours. She takes her role seriously, mind, and you know you can't beat her in a fight," he said bluntly, then faded into nothing. The man left leaning against the wall blew out a long breath. One hand curled into a fist, then opened again. "Fucking shite." Then he turned, headed into Bergen at a fast walk to find an internet cafe. The museum wouldn't have what he needed, but he could already feel the pull of something in the mountains overlooking the colourful little city. He should only need until nightfall anyway, and to double-check his research. A couple of hours past sunset found Lachlan partway along the Vidden Trail above Bergen, between Mount Floyen and Mount Ulriken. He'd painted symbols under one eye for sight in darkness, and so tried to avoid looking back at the dazzling city lights in the valley below. The decision to rely on sorcery instead of a torch had proven a good one, allowing him to spot and avoid a troll lurking in the trees near Floyen's summit. The northern lights began to flow lazily overhead as he climbed higher along the path, arriving at a landscape of wind, rock, and thankfully little snow. He closed his eyes, focusing until he could feel it. He smiled as he did, turning his head slightly before opening his eyes to see where he needed to go. Most would see nothing more than an expanse of cracked rock, frozen rainwater pools and thin snow. But his senses, owned from natural instinct by years of training, were not so easily fooled. He started walking, wanting to run, but wary of slipping. It was even harder to maintain this caution, knowing that Tora would be close to finding him by now, if she wasn't already out there somewhere, watching. It was an irritating quirk of nature to be able to sense the Bifrost, the ancient portal to the realm of the gods, when he couldn't sense another warlock. "It is a bad idea, what you're doing." The voice was deep, heavily accented, and caused Lachlan to nearly jump out of his skin. He turned quickly to the source of the noise, raising fists, but the figure standing in the dark made no move to attack. He was tall and pale in the light of the glowing sky, his face mostly covered by a thick blonde beard. His clothing was ordinary, a long black coat several decades out of fashion, but the entirety of his eyes were pale blue, like seawater on a cloudless day. Lachlan lowered his fists cautiously. "You think you know what I'm doing?" The Jotun shrugged. "Trying to find a way to Asgard and the Aesir. It is a bad idea. Many have done this, but it is always a bad idea." "Why are you out here doing the same then?" Lachlan asked, looking in the direction of his goal and scratching his short beard thoughtfully. "I wanted an apple. Instead of parting with one, they killed me. With a hammer. Lachlan's head snapped back around, scrutinising the strange figure again. Yes, he was a ghost. It can be so much harder to tell in the night. I won't ask for an apple then, but thanks for the heads up. Have you seen anyone else up here, by the way? A woman about my age. The dead giant shook his head. Perfect. Anyhow, cheers. Lachlan nodded and continued on his way, still scanning the area around him just in case. You can't trust the observation skills of the dead completely. It's often what you miss that kills you. The living are not infallible either. He walked into her trap about 20 minutes later, irritatingly close to the Bifrost. Runes and symbols he'd failed to see flashed on the stone around him and he flinched. But the searing pain he expected to incapacitate him didn't. He glanced at the now glowing symbols all around him, then reached out and pushed at the empty air in front of him. He cursed when his hand brushed the edge of the expertly made containment. Like an unseen wall of ice in the air, pulled a crystal stylus from his belt and began hastily scratching symbols of his own by his feet. Tora couldn't have known exactly which direction he'd be coming from, so this trap must have been one of several. She'd know he'd triggered this one, though, just as she'd know it wouldn't hold him for long and would be hurrying towards it. He finished sketching his counter ward and, squaring his shoulders with one foot in just the right place, punched forward. The containment flared with his first blow, glowing cracks appearing in the air, and then exploded outwards with the second. He dashed forward before the glittering shards had dissipated, knowing there was no time for caution now. Lachlan could see the Bifrost just ahead of him, the aurora borealis above coalescing in a whirl of colour that poured down to kiss the rock about 50 feet away. He ran as quickly as he dared towards it, leaping frozen rock pools and slipping on snow. A grin spread across his face. It was very lucky he'd wandered into a trap she hadn't been close to. Fergus might be an irritating dead cryptic, but he had been right about him not wanting to fight Tora. Tora appeared, as if stepping out of a shadow that wasn't there, between him and the Bifrost. He skidded to a halt, lifting his hands in preparation for anything she might throw at him, but she had stopped too. They stared at each other for a silent moment. Her black hair blew in the wind, and eyes like two chips of ice remained fixed on his. "Tora?" he began, then hesitated, unsure what to say. "Lachlan?" "Any chance you're here to wish me well on my journey?" "Ha ha, you know why I'm here." Her tone was light, but her eyes spoke anger. She gestured and her long wooden staff appeared in her hand. Arcane symbols glowed along its length. "Wish I didn't." He did the same, glad that she'd only attuned a staff for this. If she'd had her axe, he might as well save time and jump in the sea. "And what kind of a note is 'I have to do this, I'm sorry', anyway? That would fit on a fucking fortune cookie, Luck." "I was trying to keep you out of my mess," he said with a grimace, which deepened when her staff burst into flames. "Well, thanks." Her tone signalled an end to the discussion. She rushed forward, swinging the staff while still several meters away to send a huge wave of fire, searing towards him. Lachlan covered symbols on his own staff, sweeping the conflagration to one side without too much trouble, but then she was on him. He barely managed to block the first few scything blows, near blinded by the fiery weapon, before receiving a kick to the chest that sent him flying backwards. Rolling to his feet, he quickly wiped at the symbols under his eye and the world darkened to a tolerable level. He rubbed his chest where her boot had connected, then stamped his own staff once against the ground. Incandescent blue sparks began flickering and curling around it. Fair was fair, and he'd always had a talent for lightning. Tora's eyes narrowed. "So it's like that, is it? Tora, I just need you out of my way. I'm sorry." Lachlan took a step forward, holding the staff ready. "Well, I'm not sorry." She struck, hard, and as their weapons met, power exploded outwards in a ball of fire and blue lightning. They both flew back, Lachlan bouncing off a rock and Tora somehow keeping her feet. After a moment's hesitation, she charged forward again. Anger flared in Lachlan. This wasn't working. He was getting further from the Bifrost, and whatever happened, he wasn't going to allow himself to be taken back for the Circle's judgment. A deep growl rumbling in the back of his throat, Lachlan dismissed his staff into nothingness, then lashed out, breaking a chunk roughly the size of his torso from the rock he'd impacted on moments before. He lifted it with a roar, turning to throw it at Tora as she got within the last few meters of him. Blue eyes widened in surprise, but still she managed to throw up a deflection ward just in time. The boulder exploded in a cloud of pulverized stone, whipped away by wind as he advanced through it. He found her still standing, looking down at the two halves of her shattered staff. Sparks crackled from Lachlan, but she stepped into his path again, looking up with anger in her eyes. She said nothing, instead quickly tracing a pattern in the air with her twin staves. Lines of fire were left in their wake. He saw the danger too late, unable to halt his forward momentum. He ran straight into her spell, the pain lanced through his entire body as the electricity coursing over it was forced within. That should have been the end, but he was too close to give up. After a moment's whiteout, he forced his eyes to focus on the stone he had collapsed onto, forced his arms to move and, despite the agony, his legs to take his weight again. He looked up and saw the Bifrost, still only meters away, and took a step. Then Tora's weapon cracked off the back of his head and everything went black. When Lachlan came to, she'd leaned him into a sitting position. The agony was gone, but another spell bound his wrists and ankles together. So, what was the plan? Lachlan glared at Tora, who rolled her eyes. Get to Asgard is not a plan. It's barely even an idea. He shrugged as far as his restraints allowed. Aye, well, the rest of the world barely has a clue. Granted. Tora paused, cocking her head to one side in thought as she regarded him from her seat on a rock across from him. Did you consider that they might just kill you as soon as you walk through that portal? I might get hit by a car when I cross the road to buy beer. It's worth it. Fine. She looked at him for a moment, considering. Let's go then. The spell holding Lachlan immobile dissipated, but he didn't move immediately. He was too surprised. Back to Scotland. Nah. You know you don't have to do everything alone, Lach. But you just beat fuck out of me. That was for the note, and because you deserved it. What about the Circle? Your orders. She shrugged. I'm bored, and I deserve a holiday. Midgard's shite this time of year. He stared at her. Tora smiled at him for the first time in months. How did you lift that rock, by the by? He hesitated, then shrugged. Ancestry. Same reason the Bifrost won't kill me. Reckon if I hold on to you, it won't harm me either then. Let's go. Lachlan followed her, not fully comprehending, but not wanting to question his luck. They paused at the waterfall of light's edge, looking up to where it coalesced into the aurora borealis, then around at the rocky landscape of Norway. So, for a plan, get to Asgard, then find a way to save the world? It's a start. Tora grinned and took his hand. Also, you owe me a staff. Lachlan nodded, smiled, and they stepped into the light. Thank you for listening to End Days. Written and narrated by Alex C. Stewart.